our panel discussion that we're about to have. I think in this sort of transformative space, I think we all kind of agree on the end goals that it is that we're trying to achieve, zero hunger, healthy ecosystems, safe environments, but there seems to be a lot of different solutions that are often proposed in isolation from one another when there's actually a lot of complementarity. And so what we wanted to do was put together a group of panelists, and I invite you to come and take a seat here, who each work on in transformative spaces, but from different disciplinary backgrounds. And each scientist is actually quite interdisciplinary, but broadly speaking, we've selected these three to represent societal, economic, and political backgrounds. So without further ado, I will introduce them here, and then we'll have some time at the end for more active dialogue with the audience. And we have a catchbox mic, which you just throw at each other, and then you can all ask your questions. Should be fun. Hopefully nobody gets injured in the process. So in the center, we have Paul Behrens. Paul Behrens is an author and academic in environmental change at Leiden University. His popular science book, The Best of Times, Worst of Times, Futures from the Frontiers of Climate Science, describes humanity's current trajectory and possible futures in paired chapters of pessimism and hope. He is also the editor and author of Food and Sustainability, a textbook published by Oxford University Press, and his research and writing has appeared in a diversity of scientific journals and other media outlets, from PNAS to the New York Times and the BBC, and he has also inspired many through his TED Talk. Livia Regen, on your left, is a socio-ecological economist with a specialization in multi-level governance. She has coordinated and co-edited Degrowth Vienna's new book called Degrowth and Strategy, How to Bring About a Socio-Ecological Transformation, which was published with Mayfly Books in July. In addition to her activist work in the degrowth movement, she has researched lobbying in the context of European Green Deal, and is currently looking into learning processes for socio-ecologically responsible urban futures. And then, of course, we have our very own Ina Lehman, who is an assistant professor of governance and of global biodiversity in the Department of Environmental Policy Analysis here at the Institute of Environmental Studies at the VU. Her research interests include the conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity from local to global governance levels, as well as various linkages between biodiversity and development policies. To date, she has notably analyzed these matters from an environmental justice perspective, covering justice's requirements regarding distribution, participation, and recognition. More recently, her research focus is increasingly turning to global policy integration of biodiversity considerations in the production sectors of agriculture, fisheries, and aquaculture. And Ina is also an associate researcher at the German Institute of Development and Sustainability, collaborating on matters of conservation and development, as well as sustainable marine and coastal governance. All right, so Stuart and I will be moderating a very organic discussion. I don't know if you want to chair, Stuart.
Thank you, Camille.
No worries. But I suppose we will start with maybe just a little bit of problem framing. If you each want to go through and just define what is unsustainable about our system now, what are some of the biggest challenges that we're going to have to overcome, because I think that how we frame the problem is also quite relevant for how we frame solutions moving forward. So maybe, Paul, do you want to kick us off on that front?
Sure. So that's big. I mean, in a sense, everything's going wrong, but we've got to break that down into elements and look at what we can do to actually get to this future. I think there's a lot of agreement on where we want to end up, but that transition there, I mean, I have no doubt that we would eventually get an energy transition, that we'd eventually get a food transition, that we'd eventually get to all of this, but whether we can do it fast enough to avoid some of the really catastrophic impacts, we're on a timer here, and the timer is really where the problem is. So in describing this vision of the future where this clock is counting down and things are getting much worse, and we're going to have a very bumpy couple of decades no matter what happens now. Honestly, it's quite a scary couple of decades coming up. Everything that we know we need to do anyway will allow us to cope better for that, will give us more resilience, will address these problems, and will maybe even, for some of the unluckiest in society already, make their lives better. So we've got to keep these two things in perspective at the same time, and I'll let other people talk about some of the other systems that are driving this.
Great, thanks. Really speaking to how we use our land systems, in particular food and energy, and really focusing on that time constraint that we're working with. Maybe Livia, do you want to speak to our economy and the kind of the processes that drive these unsustainable land use patterns?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. I think it was actually quite a nice example, the introduction presentation we just saw. We see that planetary boundaries have been partially overshot. We see that human beings have left immense destruction on this planet. Not all human beings, of course, mostly human beings in the global north, of course. And then I always find it dangerous to speak about human beings rather than about systems in which they are embedded, because systems often don't leave any other option than act according to certain requirements. And the system I would like to foreground in this regard is the globalized, capitalized economy that is growth-based and that essentially thrives on the extraction of natural resources, that thrives on labor exploitation, and that thrives on expansionism. So in order to keep itself stable, in order to function, because these growth-based economies are also deeply interlinked with social systems. So often healthcare is connected to growth-based systems, the supply of labor, and so on and so forth. In order to remain stable, they have to grow. But we do know there is a lot of scientific evidence that whenever there is economic growth, there is resource depletion and there is labor exploitation. And it is. I'm very glad that the SDGs are here in principle. I agree with all of them except for SDG 8, and that says we need, which is, in my perception, entirely contradictory. We need, of course, take care of ecosystems, make sure poverty is reduced, and so on and so forth. But at the same time, we take economic growth as a given, and this contradiction needs to be overcome.
So really, within our current sort of neoliberal economy, people and landscapes have become pools of resource to exploit rather than the ends where well-being needs to be achieved. So we're kind of a backward process here, in a sense. Ina, do you want to speak to the sort of governance models that support these negative systems, and maybe you can also start shifting towards solutions of what would responsible policy look like to kind of like move us towards these
well,
big questions, I know.
That's a really big question. I think I would like to pick up on one point that Livia made about this systemic perspective, because I think in many ways, one problem of governance that we have is that governance in many ways is pretty much siloed. So you mentioned, for example, health and the environment. And health governance is in many ways, for example, separate from environmental governance, from economic governance, and like that. And I think maybe briefly already going in the direction of solutions, what we really need to think about is how we have less siloed and more integrated governance. So also the sustainable development goals, there's so many interlinkages between them, but they are not necessarily governed in an interlinked way. And I think that's really where we need to go to.
What does that look like?
What does that look like? For example, at the national level, it would definitely mean that ministries talk more to each other, that different departments within one ministry talk more to each other. But I don't know what about the local level in Amsterdam, but also there I think there would be many ways that different city departments could talk more to each other. We are practicing in science, we need to practice more interdisciplinary science, all of that. And also at the global level, I mean, we have this year, or in a couple of weeks, there will be the next Conference of the Parties of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And in December, we will have the Conference of the Parties of the United Nations Convention on Biological Diversity. And how do these talk to each other? What are the concepts to bridge the gap between biodiversity governance and climate governance across scales? I think that's the way we need to think about it. And maybe thinking about also, as you were asking about solutions, not only ministries talking to each other at the national level, but also at the global level. How do we cross-fertilize these processes? Can we have joint conferences of the parties? All of these questions, I think, would be one way, or addressing them would be one way forward.
Maybe moving the whole multilateral process from an event a year to a broader diplomatic or democratic discussion throughout the year, perhaps. Just sort of engaging.
That could be part of that process.
I got a question for Ina, because you study also sustainable use of biodiversity, also from local to global scale levels. That's one of your research topics. So what do you give what we're now discussing? What do you think of Jan Rotman's proposal just to get rid of the national scale in politics? He says it differently, of course, more nicely, but actually the national scale may become irrelevant when we work globally. What do you think of that?
I'm not sure really whether we can completely get rid of that level.
It's unimportant anymore.
Sorry?
Not so relevant anymore. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there is in fact a movement that, for example, city networks are emerging in climate governance, in biodiversity governance, and of course most of the action has to take place on the ground. So I think it's also good that these networks emerge and that they get more political importance. Still, I don't think that we should even maybe think about completely disempowering the national state, because of course this has some political legitimacy. It's the actor that we have right now that can make binding solutions. So I would not see the alternative at the moment, really.
At the moment, not. No. But, yeah. Okay.
Maybe picking up on your comment about action on the ground, maybe we can move to Paul, and you've also been quite vocal about, we have solutions, we have like a lot of different mechanisms for creating more sustainable landscapes and societies, and what does that action look like to you? What would a pathway towards these goals look like?
Yeah, so the way I sort of look at it is, people sort of say carbon tunnel vision as if it's a problem. I mean, in a lot of cases, it addresses many, many other things. If I'm a physicist, so I'm always looking at sort of where are the big opportunities, where are the biggest areas that we can move fastest to make the biggest change in the 7 years that we have to actually reduce emissions by 50%, reverse biodiversity, save land. And when you actually look at the different systems, it's quite clear. The energy system, we can electrify around 70% of it already. We can do that with cheap wind and solar. Storage is not the issue we thought it once was, although there are going to be some issues for seasonal storage, but that's in the last 30%. So that 70% is already possible. And that's a huge amount of emissions. That's a huge amount of future biodiversity loss, and also current biodiversity loss, and air pollution, and power, and all sorts of different things, the problems that we have. The food system. The food system, every single study that you look at, you need a great food transformation. And that great food transformation is a shift to plant-based diets, or at least getting rid of meat, a reduction in waste, and production changes. But when you look at what the options are in those three, dietary change over and over and over again is the biggest one. This is coming from somebody who used to eat meat and things. It's not some extreme view. It is just something that needs to happen, and it's what we can make changes with. Because the faster we go in societies and technology, the faster we move. It has a feedback effect. So one of the reasons why renewable energy now is cheaper to buy new than to continue to operate coal and gas power station. But it didn't get that way, out of thin air. It got that way because countries like Germany said, we don't care, we've got a vision for the future, for our energy vendor, we're going to put in feed-in tariffs. And you can criticize a lot of stuff about other areas of German energy policy, but that allowed us to deploy solar to make it cheap and make it available. We need to hit the demand side, the innovation, everything as well, and we have those solutions too. So, some of our works, for example, suggest that if you had the entirety of the high-income world move towards plant-based diets, we'd save an area of land the size of the EU. That's a huge amount of land. We've got work coming out in a couple of weeks looking at Ukraine and Russia. You could absorb the entire production losses of Ukraine and Russia with Europe alone going plant-based. So it improves our resilience, it improves the freedom of land. And I don't know about you guys, but when I'm often in the countryside, in most countries, I feel claustrophobic. This is not my land. This is 70% farmland, most of which is for animal agriculture. So we reclaim all of that for our local societies too. and have better access to nature, lower incidence of antimicrobial resistance, lower viral pandemics. I mean, I don't need to sort of convince you guys for this. It's a big driver of air pollution, water pollution, and these sorts of things. But to have a just transition, we need to really focus on how are we going to help people make choices on the production side that's going to be good for them as well. So how are they going to change? How are they going to rewild? One thing I forgot to mention is if we go plant-based in high-income nations and we rewild that land, we can draw down about 90 gigatons of carbon dioxide, which is about 12 years of global agricultural emissions. So it's just huge amounts. So when I'm looking at the biggest leverage points, if you're, we were saying about students who could work in the future in different areas, if you can make a 1% difference in those areas, you've made a huge difference overall. So yeah, I mean, very specific things that we can do.
Which is quite encouraging to think about the amount of influence we do have as consumers and where we hear this story over and over again, and it kind of can get tiring that, if we just shop here and not there, that's what needs to make the difference. But there is influence in that. And you were mentioning earlier the critical mass for actually creating these changes or real changes in production are actually quite low as well. Like, it doesn't take a lot of people to
Yeah, it depends on your theory of change. I mean, I'm very much of the theory of change that it takes people on the ground. I mean, because you say okay, Paul, really great stuff. Why isn't that happening already? If all of that's true, and all of that isn't happening already because of the existing politics and situation. I mean, countries are still burning coal because of the political power of coal in that country, and sometimes we've got solutions like in South Africa during COP26, where other countries decided they will bail out the South African coal industry and shut it down because renewables was just cheaper, but they couldn't do it in the politics that they had. They needed the bung of money. It's the same thing that's happened in Germany, the same thing that's happened in Spain. So that's some of the things. In terms of, the tipping points, getting carried away. If you look into the sort of the research on habits, it's different when you talk about people on the streets and habits. So if you talk about changing the norms of society, the tipping point is generally between about 15 to 40%. So you need about 15 to 40% adopting the minority activity to flip the majority. So you could think about things like plant-based diets there, that sort of stuff. If you're looking at revolutions, there's some big controversy around it, but it's much lower than that. So if you talk about people actively on the streets causing disruption, the number is about 3.5. There's some discussion about whether that's, it's lower if it's violent protest, non-violent protest, but it's about 3.5%. So very small numbers can make big differences. You get these tipping points. Yeah.
Maybe, Livia, do you want to speak to that interaction in between consumer behavior driving different systems of production and how a more responsible economy could really facilitate the translation onto the landscape around us?
Okay, I have many thoughts on this. I think that... Okay, so I think it depends on the sector about which we are talking. In principle, I think that, so when we talk about plant-based food, I think that's more than fair to appeal to people and say, hey, maybe you could rethink your, eating behavior, and it won't be a big thing. It won't discriminate between different classes. It's something that's more or less easily implementable. Yet, in general, degrowth perspective would be that rather than appealing to individuals, the problems are system inherent. So it might not be the case in, say, in Central European countries, but when looking at the US, it can be very difficult for people to access fresh food, for example. They might have a fast food restaurant close to their place, but they might have actual difficulty accessing fresh veggies. So appealing to those people to change their diet will be tricky, and that requires an infrastructural shift. That requires, for example, states or municipalities providing the infrastructure for people to make reasonable and ethically viable choices. So I think it has to go hand in hand. If there's just sort of like appeal to individual behavior without the infrastructures, it will be very difficult. It will discriminate between different classes, and especially and in some cases, unfortunately, it's impossible to act ethically because your infrastructure doesn't allow you to. Say I live in the countryside and I need to bring my kids to school, but there's no public transport system. You know, how would I get there other than taking a car, which I don't have? I think that's the thing. Also. When talking about the energy transition, I think the danger there is that we tend to overlook where the raw material comes from for producing renewable energy. So when discussing solar panels, when discussing PV cells, these all require input rare earths that come from the global south. So we in the global north might have enjoyed the privilege of thinking about how we design our energy system in different ways. But actually, the question we should potentially be thinking about is how can we design our energy system in a new way that at the same time doesn't potentially prolong colonial tendencies, you know? Who is going to get the rare earth out of a mine? It often involves child labor. These are things we don't see here locally. And I think that opens up questions not only in terms of energy transition, but also in terms of energy usage. The level to which we are using energy, is that really necessary? Is it necessary to, you know, heat and cool, for example, gyms all day, night and day long? Are there areas in which it's possible to reduce energy, and how much energy do we actually deserve to use in countries of the global north, if it means that we do that with the input in terms of labor and resources of people in the global south, and thereby actually act in a new colonial way.
Yeah,
So
great. Now I really understand you, Livia, because I think I have the same sort of script also ready. But just given also the research you've done with your team also in Vienna on degrowth strategies. So if we think about the Sapiens team, which will be in 6 months of now, we'll be roaming through the Zuidas and trying to talk to people and talk to businesses. So what can you advise them? What should they do, in fact, or how can they maybe implement tipping point strategies?
So if I understand it correctly, your addressee would be businesses mostly.
Have you been to the Zuidas or?
Not yet. No.
It's businesses, it's law firms, it's banks, it's restaurants, it's shop owners, it's there are even schools, I believe, or there are people, residents. There's also people living there. So it's a whole mix of. It's a city part, but mainly focused on the business side, and they want to rival with London City, I think.
I'm not sure this will be helpful for you, what I'm going to say now, but I think the degrowth perspective sort of like operates on it's sort of like a meta-analysis, basically, you know. Why do, so the businesses you will be talking to, unfortunately find themselves in a market. They have to make sure they compete. They have to make sure they are innovative, you know, all of that anyhow. And what we are trying to, an idea we're trying to throw out as the degrowth community is to pose this fundamental question of should the provision of essential goods such as energy and food and water and healthcare and education, should this even be subject to market dynamics, to competition and so on and so forth? Or shouldn't that be something that should be provided publicly and ensure everyone has access to it? And then it's the task of public authorities to think about how to essentially which policies will be necessary to supply these basic services in a way that everyone can lead a good life, but we also do not overshoot the planetary boundaries. In the current system in which we find ourselves, I would agree with you that it's very difficult for businesses themselves. Of course, they could, think about ethical supply chains. That, of course, will, however, because they are so pressured to make profits, make them less competitive in contrast to other businesses. And the question is, can supply chains that involve the extraction of resources in the global south ever be ethical? A colleague of mine who's from Brazil says no. his stance would be people in the global north should simply stop extracting resources from countries in the global south and see which resources there locally they can use to...
That's the circular transition again, and the raw materials transition you're talking about. Yeah, yeah, because they really say that it's really tied. It's tied to the effect to the energy transition. So you cannot see them independently from each other.
Yes,
yeah.
I would agree. Yeah.
Yeah.
Something that you wanted to say?
Yeah, well, I mean, so, yeah, no, I totally agree, you know, and so when you look at, these things aren't either or. So any individual change feeds back into the system, any system change feeds back into the individual options. So I totally agree, you know. And so we've got this sort of, I totally agree that, you know, a lot of people don't have this access, but if more people then adopt it that do have that access, then it changes the whole landscape dynamic, the choice architecture that people have, I think. And, yeah.
It seems like policy would play a key role in this. Maybe we have the consumer demand and the public support for healthy ecosystems, healthy food. We have challenges in our current economy that maybe prevent businesses from transitioning to more sustainable practices. So it seems like policy and sustainable governance is really key for protecting businesses and farmers and healthcare practitioners from market dynamics, maybe as a key stepping stone maybe towards achieving these goals.
I mean, definitely policy is very important because it sets the legal boundaries, at least in the national context. So it sets the boundaries of what is allowed and what is not allowed, and also, how, for example, it could set standards how companies have to report. I think Christian maybe will talk more about company reporting. I don't know, but they had this idea of, you know, companies reporting towards the global common good, and you can make this, of course, a legal standard. So in that sense, of course, policy is very important because it sets the context. And also, I mean, Livia mentioned, for example, global supply chains. I think there's quite some movement now, especially in the EU context, about deforestation-free supply chains and how this could be turned into European law. And there's quite some processes going on about supply chain legislation. Yeah. And I think that's really important to keep also for the broader public. When we're talking about policy making, it's also about increasing political pressure and creating the political will. I think political will is incredibly important in these processes. And of course, individual action is important, but individual action does not only have to be individual consumption action, but it could also be taking to the streets, participating in referenda, joining Fridays for Future demonstrations, and all of these things, signing petitions for deforestation-free supply chains, so that policymakers really are under pressure and feel this political will in their societies. Because I think without political will, we won't get anywhere.
Mm-hmm. Maybe adding to that, what are some key actions that scientists can make? I think that we produce a lot of really good science that really feeds into solutions and building very actionable pathways to these futures. But what is the barrier in between science and policy, or how does that become more porous and democratic?
Are you asking me or everybody?
Oh, anyone, but okay. You might have to.
Yeah, I mean, I think science, of course, has a very important role to play in terms of, first of all, providing the relevant information, and so that this political will can also form around the information that we provide. And then, of course, science policy interfaces are incredibly important. And so you had here on your slides a reference to the IPCC. Yeah. That, of course, is a global science policy interface, which I think has incredible traction by now. And it
comes every year now, IPCC, I think, right? The reports are reporting almost.
Yeah, and there's special
1 or 2 years,
reports.
Special reports. They also divide their reports also like 3 times a year, also to get more impact. Also in IPCC, they learn how to publish their results to make more impact to the public. Yeah. Public policy report, public report, scientific report, I think. They have these different things, yeah. Maybe it's good also to ask the room,
let's
some questions maybe from the audience.
Open up.
Because you may have heard all these terrible things. Oh, there's one. Let's first, the microphone.
How do I turn this on?
The box, there's a question over here.
It's on. Okay, let's go
that's-
bananas with some questions.
Okay. First of all, I just always wanted to use one of those and throw it, so that's why I got it.
You can start.
So I have it. But I will ask a question first. Actually, I would say thanks a lot to the panel. I want to thank you for not answering all the questions, because otherwise we wouldn't have to do Sapiens, right? If you knew all the answers, then we wouldn't need to go do all of this. So I think we already see it's incredibly difficult, because we always trying to circle around where do you need to start. Is it the individual and the system? And it's both. But I think we're making little baby steps, which is really, really good to see. So I have two comments. One is really just a reflection. The other is a question. My first reflection would be on the plant-based idea. I think this is a really straightforward way to change a lot, but there's incredible resistance against the idea in many quarters. And it has to do with prices, right? So, as you said, we actually only need to make or give those that would lose a lot of money, and they would stop doing that, right? So we would give the Dutch farmers a couple billions, and they would stop putting nitrogen out there, and then there wouldn't be a debate. But to get that money, we need economic growth. And there's the problem, because politicians look at it that way. And there seems to be, don't answer yet, a contradiction. So maybe you can explain that. And the other thing is, I heard from Ina, and that's really nice to hear actually, that it's all politics in the end. Because I mentioned Italy today in my speech, if you listen just in passing. We have a fascist government in Italy. We have, let's say, questionable government in Sweden, and it's not getting better anywhere in Europe, and that's already the pinnacle of democracy and liberalism. So where do you take the hope from that it will be a public, rational vote that will bring in those parties into power that will then do all the things that we just said we need to do? Because I cannot see that. So maybe you can help me out in understanding how we can make that political will. I see there's a lot of policy capture. And can I throw it now?
You can throw it, yeah, sure. Yeah, maybe you can answer. Okay. Yeah, sure, let's comment. Yeah.
Well, you know, I'm really bad at throwing. Are you good at catching? Are you good? Yeah.
Okay. Good. Philip, you stole my question, which is good. Hi. Am I talking to the right? Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Good.
You can hear you. Yeah.
This is funny. It's not an SDG ball though. You should work on that, I think. Anyways, hey, really thanks a lot for a very interesting panel and for organizing all of this. My question is very much on the line of democracy, because being from Sweden, just also coming back from Italy. The winds are, in one way, we're going into the right direction. There is a green wave in Europe and in liberal democracy, but that's mainly at the expense of maybe socialist parties, which are diminishing. The bigger wave, I think, is a right-wing wave, and it's not, the classic right-wing parties, but a lot of even more right-wing parties gaining a lot of traction. Sweden, where I'm from, of course, being the latest example, and their environment is not on their top priority. But many of the transitions that you talk about, and also I think Rotmans, etc., just demand really heavy state intervention. So what hope is there for like a liberal democracy to generate these changes? Because often I hear more democracy is needed, but I'm like, well, should we just have parts of them involved, of the population? Then that then suddenly goes against the grain. Yeah. So what's the role of liberal democracy in all the changes that you want to accomplish? Should I throw this again? Or?
Yeah, you can throw it to me.
To you?
Where not? Okay.
I'm not sure which one of you want to start, but I think that we should
over around there. Yeah.
Speak to these first, maybe before we pile on
a small response, maybe to comments, because I think citizen assemblies, which I presented, are like the answer. So, if a liberal democracy is functioning, we can have in multiple countries has been successful also implying citizen assemblies, which can have a different sort of government, a different sort of influence also, which tends to be not depoliticized in one way.
The thing with the citizen assemblies is it shows what the polling shows and what the surveys show, which is people are further on than we think people are on the subject. So if you look at the Citizens' Assembly in the UK, where they talk to 108 people from across the country, all sorts of different backgrounds, and they said, we've got this problem, how do you want to fix it? By the end of it, they were saying, let's ban SUVs, frequent flyer levies, let's get rid of I mean, ridiculous stuff, way beyond where the politics is at. People are really there, so it's sort of how you harness that. I totally agree with you. It's very scary the way in which the politics can be harnessed for these different outcomes. But if you're able to have these democratic structures with these citizens' assemblies, then it's feasible, and people are way beyond where the politics are at.
It's a question up there. Yeah.
Hi. Great to see that the theme of Sapiens is collaborative action. I have a question about collaborative action. Olsen described the dynamics of collaborative action already in his book, and Ostrom gave some very specific factors that are required for collaborative action, such as a law system. The examples given in the book are all hyper-local, for example, fisheries or fresh water use in the mountains. My question is, the big collective action problem we are facing, climate change and also other collective action problems, are global. And on a global perspective, these hyper-local problems are extremely easy. On a global level, we don't have a law system. We don't have many of the things that are hyper-local, for example, a lot of social interactions. How do we tackle global collaborative action problems?
Sorry, the money thing, the money's there. The money's there for the agriculture. We've got the subsidies, we're just paying it for the wrong things. So we're paying it for land and clearing it rather than rewilding and biodiversity, sorry. Yeah. Don't want to hog.
Maybe could I briefly add on the money question? Because I think that this is also a narrative that is can be easily used to create these artificial binaries that don't exist. We can either solve social issues or ecological issues. You know, if we don't grow the economy, there won't be jobs, or these kind of things. And I think that is a sort of binary thinking that serves certain groups that currently are in power and don't want to make any changes. I don't think there's such a thing as too little money. I think it's a matter of how it's distributed. And when we look at global inequality, or when we look at inequality within the global north, it is striking how the top 1% or how the top 10%, how much they own, it's entirely unnecessary. Nobody needs that. They own several houses, have luxury products as a standard go-to product. I think we need to fundamentally pose the question, which kind of level of wealth is ethical in this world, given that some people starve, and given that this wealth is built on the back of people who are now struggling a lot, and who feel the repercussions of the climate crisis immensely. So I think it's a matter of distribution. There's, very old and simple, but wealth tax and income taxes. But I understand that, of course, the people who sit in politics are the same that probably don't want to have their own wealth being taxed, right? So I think it boils down to building a critical mass that can see this issue, that can become aware of inequality. And some people would also argue that the right-wing backlash is actually a response to the striking inequality we find in society. And this is merely a reflection of the fact that certain segments of society don't feel like they have anything to say, they don't own anything, and they don't have a good life, and are just working 24/7 in a shitty job, and of course, then cast protest votes, which shouldn't be surprising. Yeah.
Okay, was a question up there?
But maybe...
Yeah?
I'm not sure.
Yeah. On the global level.
Did you want to say something?
Yeah, maybe you can first answer the question that was already asked.
Maybe you can ask again.
Okay, take the microphone then. Yeah.
Does anybody want to speak to collaborative action at the global scale?
Yeah, I'm sure I cannot answer your question, but I can speak to it maybe. And I think this raises a very important, even higher level point, because I think we really also need to talk about trade-offs when we talk about sustainability and sustainability solutions. And I know this is to be a solution-oriented space, so I'm sorry if I drop some water into the wine, but I think we also need to really take into account that maybe at some point we won't resolve all the tensions. And I think what you mentioned really is a tension. So I do think that at the global level, we do not have the same kind of, what you said, community-based collective action that we can have at the local level. So, and in that sense, also getting back to what Philip said about where do we get the optimism from, I'm not overly optimistic that we can overcome all of these tensions, and that also that political will create all the solutions, because, as you said, the political will is not there. It's not always there at the local level. It's certainly not always there at the global level. And I think we really need to talk about, trade-offs. How do we get from collective action problems, or that there is a trade-off between like the scale at which we are addressing problems. So obviously climate change, biodiversity loss, and so on are global level problems, and they need to be addressed at the global level, but they also need to be addressed at other levels. And collective action, maybe like the Ostrom type of collective action that you mentioned, is not possible in the same way at the global level as at the local level.
Maybe launching off of that, Ina, do you think that it would be enough to at least alleviate some of the pressures through changes in our sort of European economy and consumption patterns if we stopped needing so much rainforest to produce soy for beef, that would at least free up some space for local democratic solutions in those spaces, and removing the pressures might be enough?
Enough is maybe difficult.
Well, enough is wrong. Might be something, might be...
To some extent, maybe, but enough, I would doubt.
Can I give an example of a very small step that can happen at a global level? And that's something like the carbon border adjustment mechanism, which levies carbon coming into Europe. And the studies that look at carbon tax show that patchworks of little carbon taxes around the world, there's an incentive for all the countries to adopt that price. And so you can get international legislation that's quite sort of economically directed from patchwork. Not enough, not going to address anywhere near enough, but these are small steps along a road that might actually help. So just to give one example of how it could, these things can work.
Yeah. There's a couple questions there. Now first there, then there.
Thank you all so far, but I want to just challenge a little bit this assumption that it's easy to transit to a plant-based nutrition, because food is more than just caloric nutrition requirements. So what's the role of citizens on it? Like, should we just say to Brazilians or people from Argentina and Uruguay, okay, we know that barbecues are quite important in your social life and part of our identity, but sorry, no barbecues anymore?
Yeah, well, just really quickly. So that's why I focus a lot on the high-income nations where a lot of plant-based proteins are available. So if it's actually required for nutrition, then I don't tend to look at that. But the huge opportunities in high-income nations are just massive on their own. In terms of the cultural thing, I mean, my messaging is usually, you don't have to go all the way. Even just cutting down helps. And by cutting down, you also encourage other options that come.
Meatless Mondays, right?
Meatless Mondays, all these sorts of things.
Okay. Other questions over there? Yeah, microphone box.
Want to throw it to the front?
I'll try.
Maybe in the meantime, yeah.
Heads up.
Almost there.
Yay. So I wanted to push a little bit on the democracy question, because we heard a lot on this sort of like systemic approaches and where are the leverage points in those systems. And what I would like to hear is where are the leverage points in the governance system? Because, for example, I hear all these debates of, okay, basically what happens, but provided that there's democracy, right? But we see this democracy decline, and I see, for example, right now following the Brazilian elections, and reading some quotes that Bolsonaro has said on climate change, it really goes back to climate change denialism. And I mean, same with Trump, right? And so I wonder, isn't there one of these high leverage points in a democratic system to have some sort of solution towards this post-truth era that we're living, where it would be clear what is good for the common good and what not. And I'm gonna pass the mic right here. I don't need to throw it.
Okay. I think education.
I think there are some suggestions. I'm definitely not a legal expert, but there's some suggestions to basically ensure that in constitutional law, there's sentences that basically ensure that whatever political decision is made, it acts in the interest of future generations. This could be a clause that could ensure that, you know, and you could, of course, specify that more for different areas and for different sectors. I think we have to be aware that people like Bolsonaro have been embedded in a globalized neoliberal economy, and they are politics and economics are not, the economy is not a separate thing, so there's deep entanglements, as you all know, between politics and the economy, and there's also partially the same interests. And I think that that's the dangerous thing, that when it's the main interest of politicians to increase profits, to increase trade relations, to make sure that you know, a country has economic growth for the sake of economic growth, not for the sake of providing basic social provisioning to everyone, and to ensure that everyone has access to water, everyone has access to education, to food and so on, then something is wrong in the way we conceive of what an economy should do. Because the role of an economy is to provide for people and to serve to their basic needs, not to lead to odd science denialist behavior in order to justify some international trade relations from which nobody benefits, but a very few multinational corporations.
Is there a way to promote greater democracy from the bottom up?
I think, I think that certainly, so the political system is so complex that certainly there needs to be bottom-up encouragement, and I think, as Ina has mentioned, those can be small things like deciding to go to a protest, deciding to join a political debate or a political forum, and of course we also heard about citizens' assemblies. These things have not really been institutionalized yet, but would be essential to institutionalize. And otherwise, I think there's also, of course, a lot of it is unfortunately discourse and communication, and this is incredibly so variable. So, yeah.
And maybe responding to the comment about how to have a just democracy, is there a way to use the Sustainable Development Goals as a top-down mechanism to ensure legitimacy of an argument or of a population's voice, do you think, Ina?
Top-down legitimacy. I mean, of course, the Sustainable Development Goals are like anchor points. That I think so, yes. But I mean, as Livia said in one of her statements, the Sustainable Development Goals as such, they are not uncontested. And maybe it's not even not only the 8th one about economic growth, but also in the other Sustainable Development Goals, there is quite some debate also about, are they ambitious, you know, do they cover the most important aspects, and so on and so forth. So I think, well, yes, they are an anchor point, and I mean, I think country reporting is directed towards the sustainability goals. So before, well, I can tell a story maybe. Before I was working at the VU, I worked at what was then called German Development Institute, now called German Institute for Development and Sustainability. And they are closely cooperating with the German Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development. And we also collaborated with them with providing expertise and providing papers and inputs, and their reporting is so much oriented towards the sustainability goals. So whatever we would deliver for them would be along the lines of the sustainability goals. So I think even in administrations, in bureaucracies, in ministries, they do have a lot of power and a lot of traction, but we shouldn't think they are a panacea, maybe.
Okay, there's 5 more. There's one question up there. He was first. You were first, right?
Here's the mic.
You were first, and then up there, and then here. Yeah, so 3 more. Okay, you first, yeah.
I'm so very curious to find out, if you look at companies, there you have seen a lot of new strategies emerging from very young people, agile and those kind of aspects. And if we look at progression within Europe, it took us from being a coal community with the Netherlands and Belgium and so on, 50 or 60 years to arrive at where we are now at the EU. So that's not very agile, it's not very quick. And I think there's urgency. So how do we enable young people with their talents, with their energy, with their qualities, with their way of looking integrated at issues to become as agile in these areas as has happened recently in companies?
More Sapiens.
Well, I'm curious to find out from the panel.
You know, I don't see it as the companies moving very, very fast. Or I think the pressure comes internally from the people who are working in the companies and externally from the people who are asking for more. I mean, we talked about the information perspective just then. You know, a study out a couple of years ago showed that the majority of the top 100 videos on YouTube about climate change are climate denial. It's not good enough. And, you know, they're sometimes talking to me and they're saying, oh, we've got all these little tools and widgets and things. I said, no, I'm not interested in your widgets. You know, do what you have to do, which we know you all need to do. If you take yourself seriously, you should do that. Coming back to that point about what scientists should do, if you take your science, you know, seriously, if this is what it means, then show, you know, you've got to do some of the legwork in the activism, you've got to do some of the legwork in providing a way of your own habits, you know, not flying, eating plant-based meat, you know, really, you know, living it, because the change happens internally and externally. So if you're talking about these students coming out and joining companies, my biggest thing for them would be, okay, hold them to account. You know, if you're working at a media company, it's very good to look at your Scope 3 emissions, but you're a service industry. I don't really care about your emissions that much. It's good, that's your minimum that you need to be doing. You know, what are you doing to say we're not going to take the contract to work with this company that's shown this way it involves itself in the power of countries and politics? And will you take the 5% hit on your bottom line not to do that? Because if you do that, then you live. And one final thing on that is what you often hear is companies saying, oh, we would move faster, but we're worried about you know, the other people. We'll move faster if there's regulations for all of us. Well, if that's the case, then all the young, you know, students going into the companies or companies themselves can get together with their representative bodies, with their associations, and they can say, I mean, when they start doing that, that's the moment I'll take some of this stuff seriously, because otherwise it's just all wishy-washy, you know, talk or accounting or offsetting or all this stuff. So, you know, that's what I would say. This, you know, the students coming out and joining these companies should be working on.
All right.
To the back, I think.
Very up there, yeah.
Very back.
In the meantime, we have about 5 more minutes, I think. Yeah, so yeah. So it needs to go up there, yeah. On the very right corner, up there. Just throw it in multiple stages. Yeah. Yes, it's one. Okay. Yeah, okay. Row by row, yeah.
Thank you very much. This is one sure way to get the attention. Thank you very much. What a wonderful discussion. What Paul Behrens just said reminds me of the need to embody the change that we strive for and of prefigurative politics and the like. But my question goes in a slightly, or my remark goes into a slightly different direction. So I think what underlies what has been said so far by all speakers is the imagination of a sustainable future. I think by and large we're looking at a shared imagination here. What I do wonder, however, is whether there are ways of enhancing this shared imagination as a catalyst for transformation. And that, of course, touches on worldviews, as imagination is always based on worldviews. And I do wonder what role the panel would see for the role of worldviews when it comes to imagining sustainable futures, specifically also for worldviews with a pre-modern outlook, which includes many religious ones, as such communities, such traditions take their point of departure often in a rather different view of human nature relationships than relating to nature as either food or foe. So I'm curious as to this underlying dimension of imagination, worldview, even religious worldview. And I'm looking forward to hearing and learning from your wisdom.
Thank you for your very complex question. Okay. Who wants to give a take? I can also start, but if you want, yeah. Well, I think one of the things actually we had picked up from a climate debate, which was online, by the way, where there was 1.5 hours of debate on how to move faster with the climate change debate. At the end, they were only talking about narratives. These were evidence-based narratives or narratives without evidence-based, but narratives is maybe is very important, of course, to tell the story to a broader audience, maybe to a global audience. And so it could be a new discipline, or it could be a new field, or it could be a new specialism to relate this story back to nature and to tell maybe where we come from or where we're supposed to be heading for.
I think that local vision is really important. You know, I mean, we talk about the bottom-up governance and mentioning that, and you know, this vision of what it's going to look like locally. You know, is it going to be droughts every year where everything turns yellow? You know, are we going to? What do we expect to see out of our front window? What do we expect to be able to enjoy from our lives? Both, you know, our working day, what we're, you know, this overconsumption that we've been talking about, and what does it look like to take the action that we need and also be resilient to the changes, because that's going to be really key. And both of those go together a lot. So I think, you know, when I think about a vision for the future, I try to bring it quite local. And then that can basically slot into lots of different worldviews. So you can have the conservationism of sort of some of the more Judeo-Christian sort of ideas, or you can, you know, I mean, the Pope recently talking about the encyclical. I'm not very religious, as you can see, encyclical. So you know, I think it's sort of like anchoring each of those worldviews to that local region, so that people can really see what that vision would look like for them: more nature, more biodiversity, better resilience, cleaner air, cleaner water, being able to swim in streams, this sort of stuff.
Nice. Okay, we only have time for one question. And there was one question up front there. She was first. Yes, I think we really have to then postpone the rest of the discussion later on. But the last question over here.
Sure, I'm not sure who was next, but you know, so.
Yeah, okay, just throw it down. Yeah.
I'm okay.
Yeah. Maybe we can just
It's bouncy, guys.
I also had a thought on that.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, we are talking about changing systems, but all the changes start in ourselves. So what can we do ourselves in our own neighborhood, in our own behavior daily, and then inspire others? I think that's the best way to do. And we talk then about community-led initiatives and how can also universities support this, and so that youngsters are inspired. And because I think the change is really needed with children and youngsters, because when they ask questions, also children, when they ask questions to their parents, why do we eat meat, or why do we still take the car instead of the bike, I think that can make the change as well.
Okay.
I'm going to challenge. I'm going to channel Catherine Ahejo and say more conversations outside your networks. If there are already people that speak, if you know everybody around you is already sold on it, then perhaps go and find some other people.
Yeah, you have to start yourself, and don't point to anyone else, but to yourself.
Absolutely. I mean, you know, I've sort of said the main ones is, you know, if you look across the whole areas, insulation, transport, renewables, plant-based diets, and you're already most of the way for climate change.
Yeah, and also that I think it's very important that we are in the collective in areas and not with a view of 4 years of politicians to the new elections, but to have area visions for 20 or 50 or 100 years. So it will not change every 4 years. You have a good idea, like the farmers in the Netherlands in the moment is a great example. Change every 4 years, and then everything what was implemented is gone again.
We can take the mic back up at the front here, maybe.
Yeah?
Yeah.
It's okay.
Maybe is it possible to add to the
All right.
question still,
So
or are you
Sure,
planning on
if
closing?
you want to add to that. Then.
Okay, no, I just wanted to say that I think one of the things that you could do is get organized in some way, join some local initiatives, join a social movement, also connect with people around. And then I think what we fundamentally lack is exercises of reimagination. How do we actually imagine a different society, a different economy? And we sometimes don't have a clue about this because we are so stuck in the present and we accept the status quo and we accept, okay, we need to have economic growth, we need to make profits, we need to overwork ourselves. So we accept the status quo too much and don't radically challenge that. And then on the question the sir had above there, I think the separation between the natural and the social that was artificially created has served a certain purpose as well, such that obviously economic systems can exploit nature, can expropriate from it, can also religion does play a role in that, as the first lines of the Bible say already, use nature for your purposes. I'm sorry if I don't want to insult anyone here, but I think that's dangerous, of course. And I think that there should be different entry points, no matter, not everyone needs to be a philosopher to understand this, but to talk about the separation between the natural and the social, because there is actually no separation. Actually, this is deeply intertwined, and the social is contingent on the natural, and without nature, people die, Yeah.
Very well said.
Okay.
Unfortunately, we need to wrap up for time, but thank you all for such a very interesting discussion.